The Sneaking Elves and the Shoemaker by Aisha Al-Mahari. Once upon a time, there was a shoemaker who made very good shoes, but thought he worked hard in a shop. Times were difficult and he became poorer and poorer. One evening, he realized he had only enough leather for one more pair of shoes. He cut up the leather and laid the pieces out on his workbench to sew in the morning when the light was better. The next morning, when he went back to the workbench, he found a beautiful pair of shoes. He examined them carefully and discovered they were made from the leather he had cut the night before. The stitches were beautiful, very tiny and neat, and he knew the shoes were far better than any he could have made. Quickly, he took down his shutters and placed in his shop windows. Soon when the door opened and in came a beautiful, unique woman. She bought the shoes and paid 2 times more than the price for an ordinary pair. With this money, the shoemaker brought more leather and enough food for several days. That evening, he sat at his workbench and cut out 2 pairs of shoes from his new leather. In the morning, he couldn't believe his eyes, for there on his workbench were 2 beautiful pairs of shoes. Who could sew so tiny stitches, he wondered, and how could they work so fast? He placed the shoes in the shop window. Rich people who had never visited the shop before came in to buy them and paid him lots of money. Each night for many weeks, the same thing happened. 2 pairs, sometimes 4 pairs were made in a night. The shoemaker cut out all sorts of shoes: men's shoes, ladies' shoes, little children's shoes, dancing shoes, party shoes with laces, shoes with straps and buckles. He became well known for the shoes in the shop and sold more money each time. One evening, just before Christmas, her sister Helen suggested that they should sneak around the corner of the workroom and see if they could find out who was making the shoes. As the town clock struck midnight, there was struggling and removing dirt near the window, and 2 tiny little men squeezed through a crack in the shutters and hurried over to the workbench. They took their tiny tools from their work bags and began to work. They stitched and hammered and stitched till a pair of new shoes lay on the workbench. Then they were worked and finished, and the elves left everything neat and tidy, and they were gone. As it was just before Christmas, Helen suggested they should give presents to the 2 little men who had helped them so much during the year. The next day, Helen made them a red and blue jackets, hat to match the shoemaker, and he stitched 2 pairs of small shoes. The shoemaker and Helen laid these gifts out later that evening, and they kept watching again. At the stroke of midnight, they saw elves scramble into the workshop and climb onto the workbench. As they did before, when they saw the presents laid out waiting for someone to open them, the elves gave a shout of joy. Yay! They tried on their new clothes straight away and were delighted. They danced around the workbench, waving the hats in the air. Then they sat down and ate all the food that was left out and disappeared as before. After Christmas, the shoemaker still cut out the shoes and left the pieces on his workbench. But the elves never returned. They knew the shoemaker and Helen must have seen them, for their clothes were exactly the right size. And most people do not like to be seen, but the shoemaker was now well known, as he had plenty of customers, although the stitches were not that tiny and neat as the elves did. But no one ever noticed, and for many years the shoemaker in the town and himself were never poor again. The shoemaker only had 1 piece of leather left. The end.